get started, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities May webinar, Developing Your Federal Comprehensive Transition and Post-Secondary Program Application. My name is Drew Andrews, and I am the Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Florida Center for Students with Unique Abilities. Today's presenter is Dr. Clare Papay. Clare is a Senior Research Associate at Think College at the Institute for Community Inclusion, UMass Boston, where she conducts research and provides technical assistance on inclusive higher education for students with intellectual disabilities. Clare works for the National Coordinating Center for the Transition and Post-Secondary Programs for Students with Intellectual Disabilities Model Demonstration Program funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education. Prior to joining Think College, she was Assistant Professor and Director of Inclusive Special Education Programs at Arcadia University. At Arcadia, she also co-founded and directed a 2-year certificate program for students with intellectual disabilities that focuses on academic coursework, employment, and social inclusion in university life, and that was approved as a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program in 2013. I want to let everybody know that the webinar is being recorded and will be available through our website, www.fcsua.org, and also the PowerPoint slides will be available also. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Clare. Thank you, Clare.
Thanks so much, Drew, and thanks for inviting me here today. I'm so excited to get to talk to all of you again about becoming a CTP. So I turned on my video just to say hello, but I'm actually going to turn it off right now since I'm presenting on this screen and my camera's right here. So they're going to think I'm not looking at all of you if I leave it turned on. But yeah, as Drew said, I work for Think College. Think College is a national organization dedicated to developing, expanding, and improving inclusive higher education options for people with intellectual disability. We're the National Coordinating Center for the federally funded transition and post-secondary programs for students with intellectual disabilities, or TIPSIDs. And I work primarily on research with the TIPSIDs and also providing technical assistance through things like this webinar today. As Drew said, I have some firsthand experience of going through the CTP approval process, and I also interact a great deal with folks who contact us at Think College with questions about their CTP application. So I'm excited to be here to talk CTP with all of you today. To clarify from the beginning, what I'm talking about today is the process for becoming approved as a federal CTP, not a Florida CTP. By becoming a federal CTP, your program will be able to offer Title IV financial aid to your students. So that means Pell Grants, work study, and supplemental education opportunity grants. There is a separate process for you to become approved as a Florida CTP, and that was explained in last month's webinar. So when I say CTP in this webinar, I'm referring only to the federal CTP process and not to the Florida process. So in the next hour, we'll review what is a comprehensive transition and post-secondary, or CTP program, and why you should apply to become a CTP. We'll go through the steps to becoming a CTP, and I'll offer some advice on how to write a successful application. We'll have time throughout and at the end for questions. It doesn't look like I can do a poll in here, but if you'd like to type in the chat, it would really help me to know where you're at in terms of becoming a CTP. So if you'd like to just put that in the chat box, you know, perhaps you're just here to gather information, or perhaps you are starting to think about an application, or maybe you are actively pursuing that approval. If you'd like to put that in the chat, that would be really helpful. So let's talk about what is a CTP and where this language comes from. The Higher Education Act is a federal legislation that authorizes federal financial student aid and programs including Title IV, through which students pursuing post-secondary education can access direct financial support for their studies, such as student loans, grants, and scholarships. In 2008, the Higher Education Act was reauthorized as the Higher Education Opportunity Act, and for the first time, it included provisions to increase access to higher education by students with intellectual disability. One of these was the TIPSED Model Demonstration Program. These are projects at colleges and universities across the U.S. that support students with intellectual disability to access higher education. There was a group that was funded as TIPSEDs from 2010 to 2015, and then there's a second group that's currently funded from 2015 to 2020. And there's actually a consortium of programs in Florida led by UCF that's currently a TIPSED. So if you hear people using the term TIPSED, what you need to remember is that's a model demonstration program. The other provision that addressed students with intellectual disability is CTP. So prior to the Higher Education Act in 2008, there were some barriers that stood in the way for students with intellectual disability who wanted to access financial aid, and CTP removed those barriers. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But by creating language and requirements for CTP, a pathway to federal financial aid was created for students with intellectual disability. So to reiterate, TIPSED means Model Demonstration Program, and CTP is the pathway to federal financial aid. Christy, I see you said that your program at McFadder Technical College, you're not sure of your status as a federal CTP application. I don't believe you are approved as a federal CTP. That's not a name that I'm recognizing.
Okay, thank you.
But certainly you could consider becoming one.
Yes, I will definitely pass on the information.
Great. So as of last month, there were 77 approved CTPs in the US, including 4 in Florida. At the moment, the Department of Education seems to be approving CTPs and updating the list of approved programs on their website on a monthly basis. So I expect that they'll add some newly approved programs sometime this week. I will actually put the link in the chat to the website where you can go to check the list of approved CTPs. And that's what I have open right here. So we can actually check right now. So we will click on Florida. And the 4 that are currently approved in Florida: Florida Atlantic, Florida Panhandle Technical College, Florida Keys Community College, and Southeastern University. So those are the 4 that you have right now in Florida. You could also look in the Think College search feature. So I'll put that link in the chat. If you're ever looking for more information on those programs that are approved as CTPs, you know, for example, if you want to reach out to somebody for some, to ask them about their application, you can go into our college search and then click on offers financial aid right here in the search bar, and it's going to pull up all 77 of those approved CTPs. And we check every month to make sure that these 2 databases are in alignment. So that's the current approved CTPs. But what is this thing that we're calling a CTP? As I said before, it's a pathway for students with intellectual disability to access federal financial aid. Prior to the reauthorization in 2008, students with intellectual disability were blocked from accessing Title IV student aid for higher education because of 2 student eligibility criteria. First of all, under traditional financial aid requirements, a student must be enrolled as a regular student for the purpose of obtaining a degree or certificate. But at many institutions of higher education, students with intellectual disability are pursuing something other than a degree or a certificate. Second, a student must have a high school diploma or equivalent, but many individuals with intellectual disability leave high school with less than the equivalent of a high school diploma. So the Higher Education Act removed these barriers by defining that eligible students with intellectual disability could access federal financial aid if they enroll in an approved CTP program. It's important to remember that CTP is not accreditation or an indication of the quality of a program. There are certain requirements that must be met in order for a program to become approved, but that's not the same as accreditation or a reading of program quality. It also doesn't give students access to federal loans or scholarships, so it will likely not provide all the financial aid that a student may need to attend higher education. But it can help to provide one piece of the funding puzzle. And as I said previously, in Florida, it does bring some additional benefits. On the next two slides, I've included the language from the Higher Education Act that defines what is a CTP. So let me give you a summary of what some of this means. So it's a degree, certificate, non-degree, or non-certificate program. So that means you need to offer one of these credentials to students who complete your program. It's offered at a participating institution. So that means that your college or university must participate in Title IV financial aid. There are a few institutions in the US that choose not to offer federal financial aid to any students. It's for students who are physically attending the college, so it's not an online program. It should include academic, career and technical, and independent living instruction that prepares students for employment. You can see on the slide that I have the word gainful crossed out, and there's been some updated guidance from the Department of Education that removes CTP programs from gainful employment reporting. So if this is something that your college or university is hesitant about, then I'm going to put a link in the chat to a document that explains this change, removing CTP program from gainful employment reporting. This is an important one for your financial aid director to take a look at. It should have an advising and curriculum structure. So in your application, you're going to include explanation of how students choose their classes and other experiences, as well as what the program requirements are. At least 50% of the students' time in the program should be spent in the 4 activities that are listed on this slide. That's credit-bearing courses, auditing courses, taking non-credit courses, and participating in internships. We strongly believe that the 50% requirement is a floor and not a ceiling, so we encourage you and advise you to aim for much greater than 50% of the students' time to be in inclusive activities, if not 100%. And then finally, it provides students with intellectual disability opportunities for participation in inclusive activities with students without disabilities. So that in a nutshell is what a CTP is. If you're still thinking, why should I apply to become a CTP? The most obvious answer is that it gives access to financial aid for students with intellectual disability at your college or university. And that's something that's really important, especially for students who have high levels of financial need. Federal financial aid can be really an important piece of figuring out how they're going to pay for college. But what we know from emerging TIMSA data, as well as our own experiences in running a program and talking to others, is that relatively few of your students will qualify to receive financial aid. Now, this is going to depend somewhat on the population of students that you serve, but a student must demonstrate a pretty high level of need in order to receive the maximum Pell Grant. For example, at the program that I co-founded, a student with a $0 expected family contribution, meaning that on the FAFSA, the family's income and assets were low enough that they were deemed to have no expected contribution to the cost of their child attending college. They received a Pell Grant of about $2,300 per year. So this was only about 1/5 of the total program cost, and they still needed to find additional sources of funding to make up that difference. Relatively few of our students, perhaps only 1 or 2 per year, actually qualified to receive financial aid. So as I said, it's one piece of the puzzle, but it likely won't be enough to pay for the whole program, although again, this is going to depend on the cost of the program that you're operating. But beyond just the obvious benefit of being able to offer financial aid to your students, becoming a CTP has benefits for your program as a whole. As I just showed you, the U.S. Department of Education website has a listing of all approved CTPs in the country, and that's good publicity for your program. For a while, I was able to say that we were the only approved CTP in Pennsylvania, and that was a really useful soundbite to use when I was talking about our program on campus. It's also a way to legitimize your efforts on campus, you know, when you can explain to your administrators that there's a term for the type of program that you're wanting to start or that you're already operating, and that it's recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. That means something to them. It means that there are others offering similar programs and that your program is a legitimate offering for students with intellectual disability. One additional reason to become a CTP is that in some states, the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency, or VR, will provide funds to support students going to college only if they attend a program that's approved as a CTP. That's the case in Pennsylvania, where I am now, and that's one reason why Pennsylvania has the most approved CTPs of any state right now. And then in Florida, in order to be approved as a Florida Postsecondary Comprehensive Transition Program, or FPCTP, you need to be seeking federal CTP approval. So becoming a FPCTP means that you can access grant funding and student scholarships that are going to help to, again, make up that funding puzzle. So if you have an inclusive post-secondary education program, or you're thinking about starting one, I would highly recommend that you plan to apply to become a federal CTP. So it's all these pieces that allow a student to access federal financial aid. The student must be eligible, they must have an intellectual disability, and they must have financial need. They must be attending an approved CTP program, and then that's how they access Title IV financial aid. The types of federal financial aid they can access are the federal Pell Grant, the federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, which is not very much money, and also federal work study. So it's really only those three things. It does not include any student loans. It's important to understand which students are eligible if you're approved, and it's students who have a documented intellectual disability who are no longer served under IDEA, so we're not talking about dually enrolled students, and it's for students who have a documented need for financial aid by completing FAFSA. If you're serving any students in your program who have a disability other than intellectual disability or who are enrolled in high school, then those particular students will not be eligible to receive federal financial aid. And then students must also meet the requirements that are set for all students who need financial aid. So there are no different requirements in terms of financial need for students with intellectual disability. So let's just take a quick look at how intellectual disability is defined for the purposes of CTP. I have the definition here on the slide. Basically, it means a student with significant limitations in intellectual and cognitive functioning and adaptive behavior. You should request documentation from your students that shows they've been diagnosed with an intellectual disability in order for those students to be eligible to receive financial aid. There are no guidelines for what that documentation should be, but just keep in mind that you'll need to verify the diagnosis, and you should keep a copy of the documentation in your records. All right, let's go through the steps of the application. First, you should meet with your financial aid office. This might be the first time that you've met with this office. I know it was for me when I began seeking CTP approval. So you'll need to give them an introduction to your program as well as what it means to become a CTP. In all likelihood, they will not have heard about the CTP designation, and even if they have, they may not know very much about it. They're also very busy people, so you should plan to give them a brief overview of what it is that you want to do, but keep in mind that you might need to do this in a short period of time. Depending on the politics of your institution, you may need to do some selling of the idea to the powers that be. I was lucky in my own experience that our financial aid office was on board right away and understood that this was just creating a pathway for our students to access financial aid, and that we weren't posing any competition or threat to existing students receiving financial aid. But typically the president of the college or university will be signing off on adding CTP to the programs that are offered by the institution. So you may need to make sure that you have approval of your president as well. Once you have your financial aid office on board, someone in the financial aid office will add CTP to the IHE's Institution of Higher Education. They're going to add it to your college or university's e-app. So if this all sounds like foreign language to you, don't worry. Your financial aid office will know exactly what this means. It's just a way of communicating to the U.S. Department of Education that your institution plans to offer a CTP program. They'll need to know some basic information about the program, such as the length and number of clock hours. So you'll need to be clear on your program requirements before it can be added to the e-app. You then need to prepare a detailed narrative that includes a satisfactory academic progress policy and a letter to the accrediting agency. In the narrative, you're going to give a clear explanation of your program requirements, meaning the courses and other experiences that are part of the program, as well as how you're going to evaluate or determine whether or not students have successfully completed each of the program requirements and the credential you're offering to students upon completion of the program. As I said before, at least 50% of the clock hours for your program should be in inclusive academic settings. That means taking typical college courses for credit or audit, taking non-credit courses, or participating in internships in settings with students without disabilities. The satisfactory academic progress policy is very important. You need to demonstrate that you have a clear plan for evaluating whether students are successfully progressing through your program. You should include in your application examples of any evaluations that you'll use for this. We have examples of applications up on the Think College website that we can share with you to show the level of detail that you need to include. And I'll tell you more about how to access those examples towards the end of the presentation. You then need to notify your institution's accrediting agency in writing. Every college and university has an accrediting agency. If you don't know who that is, you should ask someone at your institution. And there's also a database that you can use to look up accrediting agencies. Let me put that link in the chat for you. You basically write a letter to the accrediting agency that just notifies them that you're submitting a CTP application. It's just a notification. And then you include certain parts of your narrative in the letter. You should talk to your institution to figure out who sends this letter. I know for us, this came from the provost's office, but that may be different on your campus. We've heard that programs in some states have had to wait for a reply to this letter, but that wasn't the case for us. So I would recommend talking to your administrators about that part of the process. And then once you have all of that taken care of, you submit your application to the Department of Education. You wait for it to be reviewed, and you respond to any queries that they have. There might be some back and forth, and they might ask for some clarification on some parts of your application, and then you respond. There doesn't really seem to be any rejection of the application. It's really more of a process of clarifying the information, working towards getting approval. You can submit a CTP application before you begin serving students, but you need to have a clear enough idea of your program requirements before you can write the application. All right, there are a few things you need to think about to write a successful CTP application. First of all, you need to offer a meaningful credential. I have some resources from Think College listed on the next slide to help you start thinking about this. A credential is issued by an accredited institution of higher education, and it's typically a degree, certificate, or a diploma. A credential verifies qualification or competency. Students earn the credential by following and completing a prescribed course of study. So part of your application will involve explaining what the credential for your program is and the requirements that students must complete in order to earn the credential. You need a satisfactory academic progress policy. This policy explains the procedures you will follow to evaluate students' participation in and completion of program requirements, as well as what your program will do if students do not successfully complete those requirements and if they want to appeal your decision. I recommend that you start with the SAP, Satisfactory Academic Progress Policy, that your college or university already has in place, and then adapt from there. You need a course of study that's based on inclusive coursework, as I mentioned before. This is a lot easier if you've built your program from the start with an inclusive approach. It's much harder to try to retrofit a more specialized program into CTP requirements. And then, as I said, you need to notify your college or university's accrediting agency in writing. It should just be a letter that you send, and you don't necessarily need a response, but some programs have found this to be a stumbling point. So here I have a few resources listed on creating meaningful credentials, although I did check the downloadable handout that Drew will be sending out, and I don't think that the links work. So let me just post something into the chat for you. So you can access all of these resources. One of the easiest ways from the homepage of the Think College website is to just click on the search button for search entire site and just type credential. All of the resources that I have listed on this slide are going to come up right away here. We've done a couple of webinars recently on meaningful credentials because this is something that a lot of programs are finding challenging. So the first things that come up are the credentials, and then we go into the credential action planning tool, as well as some other resources on how to create credentials. So that's right there on the website. We've gathered a number of useful tips for writing a successful CTP application. So let me share a few of those tips with you now. The first tips come from staff at the U.S. Department of Education, as well as from application reviewers. And just to be clear, the CTP application is sent by your financial aid office to the U.S. Department of Education. And depending on the region on the country, it goes out to a group of reviewers. We don't know who those reviewers are. At State College, we have no part of the review process. So it gets reviewed by some people somewhere. It usually takes anything from, I would say, 3 to 9 months at the moment is how long it's taking to hear back from the Department of Education, and then the communication gets passed through your financial aid office. So they'll be the ones that will be communicating any questions to you. So some of these tips seem very simple, but they're worth paying attention to. For example, use page numbers and use your institution's name in the header of your program description. Remember that there's a 30-page limit, and make sure that you address all of the requirements. We do have a CCP application template that you can download from our website, so use that to make sure that you don't miss anything. If you follow the template, reviewers will easily be able to follow where you're addressing each of the components and the regulations. You want to make sure that you're clear and explicit about how your program works and provide examples. And then if you include any supporting materials in the appendix, make sure you explain the purpose of each of those in the body of your narrative. So don't just attach materials without explaining what the purpose for doing that is. Here's a few additional tips from reviewers. You can see that the first two of these really address evaluation and how you're going to measure students' progress through the program. It's helpful to provide examples of evaluation tools that you will use. For example, how will you evaluate if a student has successfully completed a course that they're auditing where they may not be receiving a grade for their participation in the class by the instructor? So this might be a checklist that's given to the instructor at the end of the course, but you should put an example of that in the appendix and then explain in the narrative how you're going to use that kind of tool. You should state the expected student outcomes clearly, not just completion of each experience, but what are the outcomes that you expect students to achieve at the completion of the whole program. Your program should have a balanced approach to addressing all of the requirements. So we don't recommend that you have, for example, 80% of the students' time spent in internships and then only a little time in inclusive courses. You want to make sure that you have a balanced approach. And then finally, you need to figure out the length of your program in clock hours. So under federal financial aid requirements, any program that's not awarding a degree needs to be able to do this. You need to make sure that you include all of your program requirements in the clock hours, including any employment or career development experiences that your students will be required to complete. Clock hour calculations can be tricky, so you want to work with your financial aid office to figure out the length of your program. I'm going to pause right here and ask if there are any questions about how to become approved as a CTP. All right, hearing none, I'm going to go on to one other slide. So if you are approved as a CTP, what happens? Well, first, you should celebrate. I think this here is an actual photo of a program director receiving a notification that his program was approved as a CTP. So just kidding, but I think it is a great feeling when you get that approval, and it's such a relief to finally hear that your program has been approved. But then there are some other things that you need to think about. So you'll need to meet with your financial aid office again to figure out the logistics for how you're going to track students with intellectual disability in the college or university system. This will differ at each institution, but for us, we found a way to code students in Power Campus, that's the management software that our campus was using, as being part of our program. And then we established a process for sharing information between our program office and the financial aid office So they would pull the FAFSA info on the expected family contribution, or EFC, for students in our program, and then we would confirm that we had documentation of intellectual disability for each student, and we use a shared Google spreadsheet to do this. Your students and families will need support with the FAFSA. They may not have heard of it or understand it. They may not have received that information like other college-going students would have in their high school. As much as possible, I recommend that you have the financial aid office provide this support, since they are the people who are knowledgeable about how financial aid works. All right, well, that's all the content that I have in my slides. I'm going to share 2 other resources in the chat for you. And actually, I'm going to show you these in my browser. So the first one is Think College Learn, which is an online training module that we have on our website. We have several of these on different topics, but one of them is on comprehensive transition programs. So if the information that I presented to you here today in this webinar is not enough, oops, sorry, one second. Sorry. If you feel like you need some more information as you begin work on an application, then this Think College Learn module will sort of help you to walk through the steps. And in here is where you can find some of the checklist, as well as some examples of how to prepare your narrative. So that's where you can get the examples. And then the second resource that we have is Think College Conversations. So we use a platform called Slack to stay in contact with people across the country who are involved in inclusive higher education. And we have a channel in Slack that is on CTP applications. So if you sign up here, anytime you have any questions about a CTP application, you can go right in that channel. And I'm on there, as well as other people who are working on CTP applications, and it can be a great place for you to get some guidance on any questions that you might have. All right, any other questions? Drew, is there anything that you would like to ask me while I'm here?
Claire, I really appreciate all of the information that you've shared today. And I was just trying to move the chat box over so everyone could see the screen. I'm hoping that everyone knows they can unmute themselves by going to the top right corner of their window. I'll move the chat box back over to the other side now. I just want to make sure that we allow everyone an opportunity to ask any questions. I really appreciate all the resources that you shared on the Think College website, so that folks can go there and can get information. Jacqueline, I've unmuted you, and Christy also. Do you all have any questions?
This is Christy. I don't have any questions.
Okay. All right. And Christy, you all are not approved as a CTP, but I'm sure that some of the folks there are looking at that process, because it's something that would be done during the first year.
Right, and I know in one of the slides you mentioned that you cannot have the FPCTP unless your intentions are to apply for it. Isn't that what you said, Claire?
Correct, yes, that is correct.
We've already been approved for that and have a program already at McFadder.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I know that Claire has given ways to reach out to Think College, and Claire, again, we appreciate all of the information that you've shared today. What a great presentation. And if we don't have any further questions, I do know that we have an evaluation for the webinar, and it's just been put in the bottom of the chat box there. And if folks would not mind going in and completing that evaluation, it would give us the information that we need as we plan future webinars.
Thanks so much, Drew, and for inviting me here and letting me talk a little bit about CTP. I hope that this webinar recording will be a great resource for all the programs in Florida. And anytime we're here, I should go to my last slide. Anytime if you have questions as you're working through a CTP application, you can email us at thinkcollegetA@gmail.com or contact us through the Think College Conversations on the Slack platform. And we are happy to work with you. We do have a contact at the U.S. Department of Education that we reach out to when we get some of those, kind of tricky questions. So we appreciate receiving questions from you because it helps us to pass on better information to others as they're going through this process as well.
Okay.
So stay in touch.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.